Welcome again to another video of the Conservative Historian. This one entitled A People's History of the United States. The date is June of 2020. There is a lot going on in the nation right now. We are still reeling from the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic that occurred in March but is still very much with us today. And on top of that, there was the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. Now this murder brought forth a massive movement of protests, mostly peaceful, but in some cases there have been rioting and looting. Another adjunct to this movement is the questioning of monuments, of symbols, even of writings, and of culture that has existed within the United States for decades, if not centuries. A lot of Americans look around and say to themselves, I don't recognize the type of United States that some of these people are talking about. Now, the removal or change or unrecognizability of certain aspects is actually welcome. For one example, I don't think we need a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a Confederate general. He was also not just a slaveholder, as was the majority of those generals, but he was also a slave trader. And obviously a traitor to this nation. And in 1867, he not only joined the KKK, he became one of its leaders. This is not a man who deserves the respect or admiration that a statue is supposed to engender. So the removal of that kind of a thing, done in a democratic process, seems completely logical. But that's not where things have stopped. Things have moved beyond that, questioning the very nature of the republic itself. And we've seen that in projects like the 1619 Project, in which the very birth of the nation has been assumed to have been a sin, in this case the sin of slavery. Now, obviously, the conservative historian does not buy into that. The United States has brought a level of prosperity to more people, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people across the decades and centuries than any other country in the history of mankind. The poorest people in the United States today have more wealth than 99% of those living at the time of the founding. And the founding, by the way, was 1776. Not another arbitrary date chosen by historians, journalists, and even activist lawyers with their own narratives and agendas. Our founding was 1776. Now, were there aspects of the nation that were wrong? Were there aspects of the nation at the time that were even evil? Yes, but those were aspects. The ideal of this nation, the ideal, the core of it, set out in 1776 and encaptured also in the Constitution, is still something that is with us today and formed, if you will, a beacon, an ideal of which to strive for. And so a question comes, where did all this questioning begin? Not the questioning or the look at certain bad aspects of the history of the United States, but looking at that the United States in itself was an evil entity. Well, we can look at many different sources, but there was one particular source of great interest. A very clever man did something that others hadn't really thought of. That man was Howard Zinn. And in 1980, Howard Zinn published A People's History of the United States. Now, what Zinn understood is that to have this concept of America as bad, as America as evil, was a fringe notion, because frankly, too many people had been prosperous of the nation. Not everybody. He also understood that the ideal of the nation was that everybody could enjoy the fruits of it. So he understood that this belief system was far too fringe. So what would be a clever way to make it mainstream, to pull it in there? And that is to work on the most impressionable minds within any nation, and that is the young, and that is students. Therefore, he published a textbook that could be sold as a curricula into high schools that could replace a more balanced view of history, or in some cases, originally, even a history that might have been too biased towards the United States, too talking about our good. That is not something that we advocate. We would want a balanced history, showing both the bad parts of the United States, but also that prosperity that I referred to earlier. Zinn would have none of it. In his estimation, this nation was evil. Now, how do we know that? Because he wrote about it, because he said it. So let me give you a quote right now about the basis of his book, A People's History of the United States. In it, in the introduction, he says, "What is the world? Well, and in such a world, it is a world of victims and executioners." There it is. That is the Zinn view of the entire world, that there are victims and there are executioners. And in his case, that was the United States. So Columbus was the executioner, the Native Americans he meant were the victims. In many cases, capitalists, in his worldview, are not capitalists, they are executioners. Labor are the victims. And of course, you can well imagine how that applies to race. That is the Zinn worldview. Zinn also talks specifically about the purpose of his book. Again, a quote. "Thus, in the inevitable taking of sides, which comes from selection and emphasis in history." In other words, he is clearly and very openly not saying that this is a history of the United States. He has taken a side. And in this case, his side is the side of the left, the side of the isms, that the United States was not founded on an ideal of life and liberty. No, the United States was founded on imperialism. It was founded on racism. It was founded on sexism. It was founded on capitalists, if you will, those executioners exploiting victims. Now, in this case, his ideology runs right to socialism, right to Marxism, right to that original statement by Rousseau's about everybody is in chains. What did Zinn feel about the Civil War? A classic war in which hundreds of thousands of white Northerners and African Americans died to free millions of slaves, gave them, remember the Lincoln quote, the last full measure of devotion. That's what he was trying to capture in the Gettysburg Address, was the sacrifice made of all of these people giving their lives so that other people could be free. What does Zinn feel about the Civil War? Quote, "The clash was not over slavery. The Northern elite wanted free land, free labor, and tariff reduction." Oh, there it is. It wasn't about slavery at all. Northern elites, in other words, a clique of Northerners, who he's really meaning capitalists in this case, fought an entire war, sacrificed hundreds of thousands of people. And remember, those troops went willingly to fight for a Northern elite. So either those Northern elites were really highly manipulative, or Zinn was completely and utterly wrong, as he is in so much of this book. One of the things that's endemic in this book is the shoddy nature of his history, the weak scholarship that went into it, his lack of citing any kind of really recognized or strong sources. In other words, the book is crap. And that would be fine. We could then just be dismissive of it. It was a fringe work. But here's the problem with the Zinn book. It is in thousands of high school classrooms. It is not, as Rick Santorum said, the most popular textbook in the nation, because there's really not numbers to back that up. But we do know, factually, that it is in thousands of classrooms, that this is the book being taught to our young people. That again, that the Civil War was not about ending of slavery, that it was about something else. And that's just wrong. Zinn loves socialism. At one point he devotes over 60 pages to the rise of socialism. Socialism in this nation, well, up until the rise of the likes of Bernie Sanders and AOC, was a very much a fringe part of the United States. It was not at the center of really of anything. He strongly talks about Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate. Debs' best election, and he ran a bunch of times, I forget the actual number, but he ran a number of times. His best showing was 6%. In other words, 94% of the electorate rejected Debs and his socialist views. But in the Zinn book, Debs seems like a central figure at the middle of every aspect of American life and culture. Quote, the IWW people were militant and courageous. What was the IWW? It was the International World Workers, a socialist organization. Whereas other people within this book, and you can imagine who they are, get denigrated. Socialists are extolled. Socialists are celebrated. Socialists get tons of pages, and they are militant and courageous. Yay, what heroes. So what does Zinn think about World War II? World War II is probably one of the most just or moral wars in the history of mankind. Most wars are fought for national interest, or the rulers trying to distract their people, or just pure ego. World War II was a just war to end the evils of Nazism and the terror that Japan was inflicting upon East Asia at the time. But what does Zinn think about World War II? Well, he calls it sort of, if you will, derogatory. He calls it the People's War. But he doesn't really mean that. He puts it in quotation marks. Here's his quote on World War II. However, blacks, looking at anti-Semitism, might not see their own situation in the U.S. as much different. So what Zinn is trying to do is basically implying that people within the United States were taking 6 million African Americans, putting them first into camps, and then sticking them in ovens. Isn't that what he's doing? Isn't that the equivalency when you say that what the blacks underwent was similar to what the Holocaust underwent? Frankly, that's crazy. And whenever I see those types of analogies, I think that is so insulting and so disingenuous about the horrors of what the Nazis perpetrated upon the Jews within Europe during World War II. In other words, that false equivalency is crazy. Another aspect about World War II, remember, he's not done yet. Quote, the United States had clearly provoked the war with Japan. Clearly provoked the war with Japan. This is one of those Zinnian, if you will, shibboleths that has permeated over the last 40 years. Were there conflicts and saber rattling between the Roosevelt administration and the Japanese Empire? Yes, there were. Was Roosevelt concerned about that? Yes, he was, and that's why Pearl Harbor was a surprise and probably shouldn't have been as much of a surprise. But let's look at the facts of Imperial Japan. The fact is, after the Meiji Restoration, which occurred in the mid-1800s, Japan embarked upon a highly militant and militaristic endeavor to dominate East Asia. In the 1500s, Japan actually invaded Korea. Now, they were turned back by a brilliant Korean admiral, but the pattern was set. And that's why after the Meiji Restoration, in the mid-1800s, Japan again began a history of military conquest, starting with Korea in the 1800s, in the late 1800s. They were in conflict with China. They were in conflict with Russia. They, in fact, invaded China full scale in the 1930s. And some of the atrocities committed, specifically the rape of Nanking, shows you some of the Japanese thought process of the time. So to say that the United States provoked that to say that Japan wasn't already militaristic ignores all of that history. The Japanese home islands were not capable of supporting a modern military machine. They needed metals, they needed oils, and the Dutch East Indies had those. They wanted them. Their plan all along was to invade them. The problem was that the Philippines, then underneath United States hegemony, was in the way. The thought that somehow we provoked Japanese militarism, that somehow we put into their mindset that they were going to have to take over the Dutch East Indies for those resources, was somehow a United States creation, again, clearly ignores history and just is some narrative on the part of Zinn to devalue one of the most just wars in the history of mankind itself. And let's take him up to the modern day. Quote, "In a two-party system, in both parties ignore public opinion, there is no place voters can turn." I hear this a lot, that the two parties are exactly the same, and in some ways they are. They both today, in June of 2020, seem to be enamored of deficit spending, and there are no deficit hawks right now on Capitol Hill. And in that regard, Zinn might have a point. But to say that Reagan and Carter's philosophies were similar is either ignorance, or what's really going on here is this is extolling of a far left party, a socialist view, a people's view. And remember, let's think about that term, a people's history. China intentionally calls their army the People's Army. Marx talks about the people in this regard. Socialists talk about the people in this regard. Zinn is trying to use this book to advance a socialistic doctrine. That is obvious from all of the pages within this work. But here's the difference. There are socialists, and I've mentioned a few throughout the history of the United States, but they didn't have textbooks in thousands of American classrooms. So for those conservatives watching, I have a call to action. Call your school district today. Find out, are they teaching this book? And if they are, organize a counter-protest. Protest can work both ways. Protest your local school districts in a peaceful way, in a peaceful, non-threatening fashion, and get the Zinn book out of the classroom. Thank you.